G'day guys, you're back with Miracle Max. In the workshop today we have a Holden Jackaroo 1999 model with a 3.5 litre engine in it. The problem with it is an intermittent start problem. We need to try and sort that out for the customer, so let's hook into it. I've done some previous testing on this already, so I've got pretty much a good idea of where I'm going. But of course, when you have intermittent starting problems or any sort of starting problems, you start with the battery. What's this one like? Well, this one has been replaced because the battery was worn out. What's it like now? So it says that it's a good battery, it just needs a bit of a recharge. You can see state of charge is only 65%, which I appreciate because this hard starting is putting a little bit of excess stress on the battery. I'm not overly concerned about that. I will recharge the battery, but this is not the fault. Okay, so what do I mean by intermittent no start? Check this out. Start. Aha, hear that? Okay, so there's the fault. Let's try and diagnose it. Under the bonnet on the driver's side, this is the Australian model of course, we have our fuse panel under here, and you can see it's got starter written there. That's the relay, that's the fellow that we're looking for. Now we could check the fuse and all that sort of stuff, but I have done testing previously as I mentioned, and I'm going to head straight for the relay. So it's this bloke right here. Let's pop him out. As you can see, this is a little bit different to a normal style of relay. It's actually got 6 pins, and you would naturally assume that the control side of things would be this pin and this pin, and the switching would be here, here, here and here. In actual fact, that's not right. It can be a bit difficult to nut out a relay if you don't have the wiring diagram, and this one can be quite confusing. But let's just hook up a multimeter, I've got it on ohms as you can see, and find out where that coil of wire is, or our electromagnet. Now like I said, you would naturally assume that it would be here and here, but in actual fact it's not. It's these 2 pins. Let me show you. We should have roughly about 60 to 80 ohms, something along those lines. And as you can see, those 2 pins are giving me 79.4. So that's our coil wire. So the others are the ones that will have power, and of course they're just a switch. So I need to find out where there is constant power or switched power in the case of the starter motor. I've got my test light connected onto the battery down there, so I've got my little clampy thing hooked up to the negative side of things. We should be able to check various pins across here and here to find out which ones have power. Now we know that this is our control side of things, so there's no need to check that at this particular point in time. I actually want to bypass the thing. This one here, I believe, might be my actual control side of things. I'll just turn the ignition to on, see if that lights. I'll just go to the start position, and if this is the control side of things, I should have a positive light there, and as you can see it is. This one over here has power at all times, as you can see. So obviously there's power here, and the starter wire down at the starter motor, or the solenoid wire down there, must be one of these guys here. So it's not that hard to figure out. The reason I'm doing that is I want to prove if it's a relay fault, a control fault or whatever. So I'm just taking that whole side of things out of the equation. Now this fella here was my power wire, wasn't it? So there's 12 volts there. So all I'm going to do is put a fused wire in there. You can see that this is fused. It's got, 15 amp in there. And I'll just touch that across, I think it's that one. There you go. So I've got my starter wire. But let's see if it's consistent or we get that intermittent fault. Okay. All right, that's dead as a pork chop, okay. So we have a starting issue down at the starter motor, that direction. That's where we need to check next. Okay, so let's head down towards the starter motor. Here's an example of what we'll be looking at down at the starter motor. In particular, I'm keen on looking at the solenoid itself. It's made up of 2 contacts, this point here that comes off our battery, and then this point here that actually goes onto the starter motor itself. When you turn your ignition to the start position, what happens is this plate here pulls up back against these 2 points here. therefore allowing battery voltage to go between there into the actual starter motor itself and start the engine, in theory. So first of all, we need to make sure that we have 12 volts here at all times. Then I'm going to do something interesting. I'm going to do what's called a voltage drop test between this point and that point. That will tell me if this plate here is worn and not allowing full voltage to go between this point here and this point here. Inside our starter motor, it'll be very similar to this Toyota one. You'll find a sliding contact, which will be part of the solenoid assembly itself, the soft iron core. These will be the two bolts that come into the starter motor, this one off the battery and this one going to the starter motor itself, and these are the contact plates that always wear out. Now honestly, for the sake of this particular vehicle, it's fairly old. I'm just going to go ahead and replace the battery if my diagnosis proves true, because by the time I replace these components here, we're still going to have an old starter motor that may have issues in the future. So I've spoken to the customer about it. If my diagnosis is true and correct, this area here will be where the wear is. So let's head under the car and do some further testing. I'm in at the left-hand front wheel at the moment, and there's really not much access, guys. I've pulled back that flap there, as you can see. I've just pulled that back that away just to give me some access. But if we zoom in, we should be able to see the starter motor solenoid. Let's cruise in on there. And what we can see there are two components. That one there, let me point it out for you. So that fella right there is the wire that comes off the relay. That big fella there is the battery cable that comes straight off our battery, that bottom one there. I'll expose that, but I need to get to the other one on the other side of the solenoid that goes straight onto the starter motor. You can see I've got a lead attached to that battery cable going onto the solenoid. Underneath the car, I've got a wire hooked up to the other side of the solenoid. I've got extension wires on there so that I can hook it up to my multimeter and have a look at it while I'm cranking the engine. At the moment, we have a potential difference of 12.6 volts across that point. We want no voltage drop, so when I start it, there should be 0 volts there. If it doesn't want to start and there is a potential difference, that will indicate how many volts we're losing. So let's crank it and see what we find. Okay, we're losing 11 volts. So we've only got about 1 volt, something along those lines, maybe even less than 1 volt going across that solenoid, and certainly that's not going to start our starter motor, is it? 10. But you saw when it did start, there was no voltage recorded there. So yes, we've got a solenoid issue on the starter motor, but as I said, the starters are actually quite difficult to get out, so I'll be replacing the entire starter with the approval of the customer. I've disconnected the battery on the negative side there, as you can see. This does not have a genuine radio in it or audio system, so I don't have to worry about losing radio codes. Of course, I'll have to reset up their clock for them after I've done the job. You can see now on the top of the solenoid, I've removed the actual solenoid or start wire, that brown looking thing, and of course I've taken off the battery cable off to that side of the solenoid. In case you were curious, it was a 12mm nut. I've removed this heat shield so I can gain access to the starter a bit better, get rid of that wiring, etc. And of course there's a couple of bolts back on the starter motor that are a little bit difficult to access. The manufacturer tells you that you need to remove the front section of the exhaust pipe to remove the starter motor. But from what I've seen on YouTube and elsewhere, you can just undo your engine mount bolts, that's those two guys there, and lift the engine on one side. That should give you enough clearance to get the starter out. Let's see if that works. I've now pulled out those two 14mm bolts. I can now lift up the engine just on one side, hopefully giving the clearance that I need to get the starter out. Now I've seen other people not remove this cross member, but for me to gain access to a good jacking point on the sump around here, I want to make sure that I've got plenty of clearance. Also, it'll allow for the starter to come down even easier. So I've just pulled that cross member off for ease of access, I guess you could say. Okay, now I have clear evidence that engineers do hate mechanics. See that bolt up the top there? That bloke, let me see if I can point it out to you. Okay, fat finger coming through. That fella there is one of the starter motor bolts. That fella there goes onto the bell housing, and it's just a plate, but you can't get your socket onto this fella over here because that fella's in the road, and you can't get a ratchet or anything on that because there's a what's that, the starter itself I think won't allow you, so you've got to do it by spanner, do it by hand. Oh goody, engineers hate mechanics. Clear evidence. Secret tip, if you use a 3/8 drive socket, you can sneak it past that stupid 10mm bolt that's stuck in there. I couldn't get the 10mm out because you can't even put a ringy on it. You have to use an open ender because it's so close to the engine block. Oh, mate. So anyway, 3/8 drive, then I had to pull my socket off because that got caught on the bolt and my light just went out. Good one, Max. And I was able to get the bolt out once I got the socket off and undid it by hand, pulled it out. So, state of the nation, mate. Not fun. Look, I have wiggled and jiggled and done everything in my power to try and get this beast out. And the problem is the stuff that I've seen on YouTube, etc., they sort of, eventually get the thing out. It's very tight fit. But this here is a Denso style, and check out the size of the solenoid. It's absolutely huge. It's very similar to the Toyota style, as I mentioned before, and it is massive. It's almost as big as the actual motor itself over this side. So look, I don't think I have any choice but to drop the exhaust, and it's a bit of a pain to get to. And I don't want to break any bolts either, so I'm going to have to put you guys aside while I grumble, moan and complain to try and get this thing out, but I'll let you know what happens and how I get it out. Now I managed to get the front section of the left hand side of the exhaust pipe off. That was a bit of a pain because the engineers, of course, what did they do? They did a caged bolt in there, so you've got to lever the hell out of the thing to try and get it out, otherwise you'd have to undo the other side. Excuse my grotty hands. Even so, you've still got to do a bit of a wiggle jiggle with this starter motor. Okay, that's the position you've got to have it in to get it out. So it's normally laying that away. We've now got it tilted that way. We should be able to get it down. Oh, yes, I'm so happy. All right, that's out. Job's done. Well, partially. As you can see, these two starter motors are a different design. This is the one that came out, the Denso one, and this is an OEX brand, made in China, whatever, don't care. The point is that, like, you can see the hugeness of this fella in comparison to that little guy there. And this is the one on the net that you'll see. Yes, you can just jack up the engine mount and you can slide this bloke out. Yes, I could do that quite easily if it wasn't that size. That is huge. So I'm sure this little bloke should go in quite easily, but then I've got to put the exhaust back on and all that sort of stuff as a result of having to pull this fella out here. But happy days, I have in fact got this fella out. That was my main concern. Later on we'll pop this off and have a look at it and just see if I did diagnose the situation correctly or not. But for now, this fella needs to go back in. I've also bench tested the new one just to make sure that it works before I put it in. So that appears to be good to me. That's ready to go in the vehicle. I had to do a quick thread repair on one of the bolts here, but don't get caught. This thread here is 1.5mm. This one is 1.25mm. They're both on the starter motor. This is the longer one, that's the shorter one. Why would you change pitch halfway through, the same component? It's ludicrous. 1.25, 1.5. There we go. New starter motor fitted. I did have to repair a bolt thread. For some reason it picked up a thread. But that's all done. Fits nicely. The beauty about this one is that the solenoid is on this side. The other starter motor had the solenoid on the inside, very hard to access. Now look, I don't know if this starter motor is any good or not, but OEX provide a 90,000 K 3-year warranty. Certainly not a sponsor, but that seems like a good warranty to me on a passenger vehicle. And so I'm just going to quickly test it before I put the exhaust and everything else back into place, just to make sure that it does click over and everything's right. Yes, I've got the starter motor in. It's all hooked up, ready to go. Yes, I've got the exhaust back on. But have a listen to this. Yes, it started the vehicle fine. No issues there, but that sound is not good. That is an engagement issue where the pinion goes into the drive plate. The measurement there is wrong. I've been to the supplier, they've suggested that I shim it. Great. So where it gets shimmed is across here. It's to pull the pinion away from the drive plate. But the problem is what they've supplied me is the only ones they have, and have a look, it doesn't fit. So what I'm going to have to do is get the old die grinder out and make it bigger. So you drop the bolts down, you slide this in, you tighten your bolts up, and hopefully it doesn't make that horrible sound. Yes, it's a bit ugly, but what I need to do now is remove the outer bolt, loosen the inner bolt, and then with this bolt removed on the outside, I can sneak this in through there, get it in past that one, drop it into place there, and then put my outer bolt back in and tighten up my inner bolt, of course, and hopefully that should bring the pinion away from the drive plate. I've got that shim in now, and as you can see there's a little tail that hangs out so that you can pull it in and pull it out, but I've put the thicker one in, and so that slid in okay. It wasn't a big job, but let's see if it fixes the problem or not. I had heard that these were a bit touchy with their pinion clearance, but this is ridiculous. I've got 4 spaces in there, too thick, too thin, and it's 95% right. It's pretty good, and I'm going to let it go at that because I think the pinion should wear in okay. But yeah, 4 spaces, that's a bit ridiculous. I don't know if it's the brand itself or just that these motors are extremely fussy with their pinion clearance. So anyway, I can now assemble it and give it back to the customer. I'm just about to put those bolts back in the engine mount that I pulled out before, those fellas down there. Of course it's a long way down. You put this here bolt in your socket and plonk, it falls out before it gets into place. I'll show you a little trick. You mightn't notice it, but inside my socket is a neodymium magnet. It's a rare earth magnet. Now all it is just one of these fellas. I have a couple of these floating around, and I just use them when I need them. But the beauty is that if you put your socket in there, if you put your bolt in there, sorry, in this case it shouldn't fall out like that until I want to pull it out. Of course, once it's in the thread it should just come out nicely. I've got 2 in there at the moment, just because it did fall out the first time, but that second one is just holding it nicely. Just like that, it's not going to fall out. Perfect. And of course afterwards I can pull those magnets out and use them on another socket. Just a little quick tip, the 2 left-hand engine mount bolts are now in place. So what was the cause of the problem that we were having, that intermittent hard starting, and of course that voltage drop from this point to this point? It's a common fault on these. Well, it's hidden behind door number 1. So we'll rip that fella off and figure out what's wrong. I've taken off 3 7mm bolts, and in behind this door here, as we get him out the road, you can see that this is the solenoid section, as you can see here. And what happens is this little plate here meshes or goes up against these 2 points here and here. This is our battery terminal here, and it goes across to our starter motor on this side, and it's basically just a switch. That's all it is. But have a look, all the stuff coming out there. It's not attractive, I can tell you that much. And this fella here is also half verschnookered as well. You can see it's all pitted and burnt, etc. Look, you can get replacement parts, these here and here. Like I said, very typical for the Toyota range, but in this particular case, this Denso one on the Jackaroo has the same sort of setup. So I'm sure that you could get the parts, but as said to the customer, your vehicle has done pretty much 200,000 Ks. For the amount of work to put in the starter motor, I suggest that we put in a new starter motor all told. Once we sorted out those pinion depth issues with the shims, she's good as gold. So I'm happy that we've put a new starter motor in, not just a reconditioned one or repaired just this solenoid section here. Yeah, you can see it's just full of dust and dirt, etc. And even the solenoid, this soft iron core section here, you can see where it's been jamming, etc. Shiny marks on there, that's an indicator that it's jamming. And of course, no contact, no goey. So yeah, she's verschnookered for sure. So I've started this thing like a dozen times, and each time it's pulled in and it's started. It's still got a tiny bit of noise, but I believe that the pinion gear and the drive plate will mesh eventually, cutting out that noise. It was just a depth issue, which apparently is quite common on these, the Commodores, as well as some of the V8s as well. I'll just take it for a quick road test and make sure that it's fine, and then I can hand it back to the customer. Well, there you have it. After a road test, I'm happy with the results. Certainly wasn't the quickest and easiest of operations to go through, but the testing procedure was quite definitive, so I was happy to replace that starter motor. If you got something from this video and you haven't already, guys, subscribe to the channel please. Give it a like, feel free to comment down below. Don't forget about that notification bell. You don't want to miss any future videos, do you? So guys, until next time, this is Miracle Max signing off. I will catch you later.